Today we're talking a little bit about the fight-flight process and about the freeze process. We're going to discuss how they interact with each other and talk a little bit about treatment options for clients who've been in this place of fight, flight, or freeze. This is the diagram that I prefer when we're talking about fight, flight, or freeze. And the reason I prefer it to the alternative is because I think it's a better representation of what's actually happening in the nervous system. Now, there's another one that talks about the window of tolerance. Have we heard about the window of tolerance? So the window of tolerance is fine. It looks like this, basically. It doesn't necessarily have this thing. And it puts freeze up here and fight, flight down here, and says this is the window of tolerance. And that's really interesting, and there's some sense to it, but this one makes a little bit more sense to me, and I'll tell you why as we're walking through this today. So if this is a picture of your brain, we're going to do some gross oversimplifications of the brain today and talk about kind of how it works. This orange light bugging me, but I guess we'll just have to make do. So when we talk about the brain, you can sort of divide the brain into roughly 3 parts. And it works kind of like an onion, sort of. It's not exactly correct, but that's one way of thinking about it. Back here is the brain stem, back here in the back of your head. Kind of in the middle is the limbic system, and that's the amygdala and all the stuff we're hearing a lot about now the last 10 years or so. People have been talking about this all the time. The amygdala and the limbic system, all the fun parts of the brain that handle fight, flight, and then we're kind of exploring with PTSD. And then on top of all this stuff and kind of around it, we have developed a giant cerebral cortex. The CT, or CC, I guess. CC for the cerebral cortex, limbic, and then brainstem. So these things developed from an evolutionary perspective in layers. This thing is super old. The brainstem structure that we have is very similar to the brainstem structure that you'll find in lizards, for example. And it's really good. I talk about it as simple brain. And the reason that it's simple, we talk about simple brain, is it does a really good job of going on or off. And it controls things that go on and off a lot of the time. For example, breath. Everything here, another word for this is the autonomic nervous system. Now, the autonomic nervous system actually comprises both of these. The autonomic nervous system, aka the automatic nervous system. So you don't sit around and think about your breath usually, unless you're in meditation. Breath is happening of its own. Breath will happen of its own. Your heart doesn't beat because you tell it to. And if you get nervous, your heart doesn't beat faster because you tell it to. It does what it does automatically as a response to the environment. And so that's the best way to think about simple brain. It goes on and off. Simple brain is responsible, as I understand it, for the freeze response. The freeze response job is to shut you down and prepare you for death. Also to hide you from predators that focus on movement and motion, which is most of them. Okay? If you freeze, sometimes you'll get away. And that's what the freeze response does. The freeze response is really interesting biologically. We're all very familiar with what the fight-flight response does biologically, right? Anytime you ever you watch a scary movie, your heart gets going, really interesting things happen. All the blood goes to the extremities. All the blood goes out here. Isn't that cool? Because what do we need? We need as much oxygen in the muscles to prepare us to fight or to run away. So all the blood goes out here. Everything starts moving. All the systems in your body that aren't necessary for fighting or fleeing shut down. Okay, the sexual response system. Like you watch a horror movie, you don't come out of it all fired up and ready to roll, usually, unless you have sex coupled with some interesting things, which happen sometimes. But as a general rule, you're not sexually aroused when you're in a fight-flight system. You're in a fight-flight situation. Also, your digestion will shut off. And so it's really interesting, too, when I find all these people who have Crohn's disease or some of the really interesting digestion